Hey team, welcome to our second video about imperialism and the Spanish-American War. Today we're going to talk specifically about the Spanish-American War and China's open door policy. So starting with the Spanish-American War, we should have our graphic organizer in front of us and there will be blanks that you need to fill in throughout the notes. So taking a look at this map, we need to be familiar with a couple of these islands that we're going to be talking about. So this map specifically shows you the American Empire as of 1900. So we're going to go backwards in time and then work up to the status of the United States in terms of this map and the different territories that we acquired, and I'll explain how we acquired these different islands and territories. Okay, so we're going to start with the overview of the Spanish-American War. So this conflict is between Spain and the United States, and it occurs after the United States intervened in the Cuban War for independence. So Cuba was fighting with Spain to become an independent nation. So America had some interest in Cuba, and they had their eye on it for about 50 years. And in the 1850s, diplomats recommended to President Pierce that the U.S. should buy Cuba from Spain. Between 1868 and 1878, Americans sympathized with Cubans who rebelled unsuccessfully against Spain in their first war for independence. So in 1886, the Cubans failed to gain independence. They did force Spain to abolish slavery. So American capitalists then invested millions of dollars in sugar plantations on the Caribbean island. In 1895, a second war for Cuban independence erupted, largely due to the influence of Cuban poet Jose Marti, who organized a resistance against Spain, in part by using guerrilla warfare and deliberately destroying American-owned sugar plantations in hopes of provoking U.S. intervention to help Cuban rebels gain independence. Marti, however, feared that U.S. imperialists would replace the Spanish as imperial possessors of Cuba. Many Americans did not, we're just going to start over. So many Americans, not just businessmen, invested in Cuba and because they sympathized with the Cuban rebels, taking on the cry of Cuba Libre, which was similar to Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death. So the USS Maine sinks in Havana Harbor. And what happened is the boat exploded only a few days after the Delome letter was published. And so American resentment turned to outrage and called for war. So the Delome letter was a story written by yellow journalists by Hearst's New York Journal. So William Randolph Hearst in February 1898 published this letter. What led up to this was President McKinley preferred to avoid war and tried diplomatic means to resolve the crisis in Cuba. Spain relented, at least in part by recalling General Weyler, modifying the policy on concentration camps and offering Cubans limited self-government. But American anger was stoked when this letter by Enrique Dupuy Delome was stolen by a Cuban rebel and leaked to American newspapers, who were eager to create a scandal. The Delome letter criticized President McKinley in unflattering terms, and Delome was forced to resign, but the damage was done. Americans were very upset. So the USS Marine exploded. Early in 1898, President McKinley sent the battleship USS Maine to Cuba to demonstrate the government's concern for the island's stability and also to help Americans escape should violence escalate. On February 15, 1898, the Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. 260 American sailors were killed. 2 investigations were immediately undertaken, one by the U.S. naval officers and another by Spanish officials. The Spanish concluded that the explosion was an accident and that Spain had played no part in the tragedy. The Americans argued that the explosion was caused by the Spanish in Cuba, presumably by a mine. So the American yellow press sensationalized the sinking of the USS Maine, offering a $50,000 reward for the capture of the perpetrator. Americans were outraged, and calls to remember the Maine helped to influence the U.S. government to take action. So, after a formal declaration of war on both sides, Commodore George Dewey destroyed the entire Spanish Armada that was anchored in Manila Bay in the Philippines, without losing an American life, and Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders took Cuba. So, the battle for Cuba, to give some background to this slide, began with a naval blockade around the island, effectively trapping the Spanish fleet in the harbor at Santiago. America's army was much less prepared for war as compared to our Navy. The U.S. maintained a very small professional force, most of which were volunteers. It was the size of 125,000 sent to different training camps that lacked adequate supplies and effective leaders. There's also a shortage of guns. Troops were given wool uniforms to fight in the tropical islands of the Caribbean. Many of the officers were old Civil War veterans. And then in June 1st of 1898, 17,000 U.S. troops landed in Cuba and began to converge on the port city of Santiago. So we have 4 regiments of African American soldiers. The Rough Riders was a volunteer regiment led by Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt that led the charge up Kettle Hill on July 1st, along with 2 regiments of African American soldiers. Their victory cleared the war for an infantry attack and capture of strategic San Juan Hill later that same day. On July 3rd, the Spanish fleet sailed out of the harbor at Santiago and into the waiting American naval blockage, and the Spanish fleet was destroyed. On July 25th, American troops invaded Puerto Rico, where they met with even less resistance than in Cuba. On August 12th, Spain agreed to a ceasefire, signing an armistice with the United States, ending what Secretary of State John Jay called a splendid little war. On December 10th of 1898, Spain and the United States met in Paris to agree on a treaty, and the Treaty of Paris contained the following provisions. Cuba gained its independence, and the United States acquired the territories of Guam and Puerto Rico and paid Spain $20 million for the Philippine Islands. So, we have an overview of the results. America is entering the world affairs. The Spanish Empire is ending as Cuba is independent. The Treaty of Paris was signed, and this allowed for temporary American control of Cuba and indefinite colonial authority over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines after purchasing from Spain. So there was a lot of debate over the Treaty of Paris that sparked even more debate in the United States, which centered on whether or not the United States had the right to annex the Philippines, and more importantly, the nature of imperialism itself. President McKinley viewed all of his options regarding the Philippines as fraught with trouble. If left to govern themselves, he believed the Filipinos might fall into anarchy. If the Philippines were independent, another imperial power like Germany or Japan may try to seize the island, sucking the U.S. into a major war to protect its interests. So McKinley viewed his best choice was to annex all the islands and perhaps give the Filipinos their independence at a later time. So in deciding the fate of the Philippines, McKinley told a group of Methodist ministers that there was nothing left for us to do but take them all, and to educate them and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. He failed to take into account that the Philippine economy was among the most modern in Asia, and that most Filipinos were already Christians, converted to Catholicism by the Spain. So, we have opponents of annexation presenting political, moral, and ethical arguments against that proposed course of action. So they argued that the treaty violated the Declaration of Independence by denying self-government to the newly acquired territories. We have labor leaders like Samuel Gompers, who feared that Filipino immigrants would compete for American jobs. The debate was settled on February 6, 1899, when the Senate voted to approve the Treaty of Paris. The United States now had an empire. Following the Treaty of Paris, the United States gained these territories that I talked about, Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam. American troops occupied Cuba following the war, angering many Cubans who feared the U.S. would simply replace the Spanish as imperial rulers. Under American occupation, the same officials who had served Spain remained in office, and Cubans protesting this policy were often jailed or exiled. But the American military government provided food and clothing for thousands and helped farmers cultivate their land and organize schools. Because of sanitation and medical research, the efforts of the U.S. military government helped eradicate yellow fever. The Cubans created their own constitution but did not specify the relationship between Cuba and the United States. So, we also have the Platt Amendment, and this was provisions that were added to Cuba's constitution that gave the United States permission to intervene in Cuban affairs. So, in 1901, the United States insisted that Cuba add to its constitution several provisions. These provisions included: 1. Cuba could not make treaties that would limit its independence or permit a foreign power to control any part of its territory. 2. The United States reserved the right to intervene in Cuba. 3. Cuba was not to go into debt that its government could not repay. The United States could buy or lease land on the island for naval stations and refueling stations. 4. Passage of the Platt Amendment resulted in the creation of a U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And 5. In 1903, the Platt Amendment became part of a treaty between the two nations and remained in effect for 31 years. So, just like I talked about, we need to make sure we fill in our graphic organizer the blank Guantanamo Bay, because the United States leased this land from Cuba and established a naval base there, and this led to the U.S. involvement in the Philippine Revolution and the Philippine-American War. So, make sure that we understand what a protectorate is, because we're going to use this word. As a protectorate is a territory or nation controlled by another, more powerful state. So Cuba was a protectorate of the United States. It was technically independent. The protectorate is in a state of dependency with little to no control over its relationships with other nations. All right, so we are going to end here, and we'll talk about China's open door policy.